learners, welcome to the 57th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's Anglophone novel. I've introduced Michelle Cliff and I mentioned that we would be discussing her novel No Telephone to Heaven. I ended the previous lecture with a reference to the ambiguous temporality, and I hinted at a dual temporality that the novel and the narrator of Michelle Cliff's novel No Telephone to Heaven hints at. This dual temporality is both a part of Michelle Cliff's own writing, as well as an important part of queer literature, queer writing, and also post-colonial writing more generally. I'll spend some time explaining what this dual temporality is and how it has been appropriated and become a big part of queer writing, and then explain a few moments from the novel which help us understand how this dual temporality works. I began this discussion by reference to a book of essays that Michelle Cliff published, and it was titled The Land of Looking Backwards. Looking backwards, feeling backwards, thinking about the past, being nostalgic with different moods. This is a very common impulse, a very common trope, a very common gesture, intellectually and emotionally speaking, in a lot of queer writing. Where does it come from and what does it mean? There are several ways to make sense of it. I'll follow the methodology laid down by the scholar Heather Love in their book Feeling Backwards. It's a monograph, it's a cultural history of early 20th century queer novels that theorizes the meaning and the value of this backward-looking glance. We can find this backward-looking glance in Michelle Cliff as well. So it's worth unpacking for a moment what Heather Love is saying. Love's point is that in the second half of the 20th century, it became possible to write about queerness or to think about queerness through the lens of pride. And this was necessary and important for a lot of activism and a lot of identity politics related work. So pride became a rallying call. Pride became a banner around which a lot of diverse individuals who were struggling not just because they were queer, but whose queerness constellated their multiple forms of civil disability. So in the process of turning queerness and in the process of legitimizing queerness as a condition and as a necessity for its recognition as a civil right, in this important political process, it was important to turn pride into a rallying call. And the reason why pride could function as a rallying call, could function as a uniting force, could actually bring people from diverse experiences, backgrounds together under the label of queerness, was because in the 19th and early 20th centuries, queerness had been defined through the opposite of pride, which was shame. And Love's point is that after Stonewall, this narrative and this whole emotional position on queerness turned into an affirmation of queerness. In fact, the very word queer was first used as a derogatory term, but the same word was appropriated because the emotional politics around queerness had turned around. And while this is all important, Love argues that for a lot of queer writers, it remained important to describe the older experiences of shame, and it became even more important in post-Stonewall era, in a time when it seemed that queerness was recognized as a civil right, and things like gay marriage and so-called normalcy defined in heteronormative, patriarchal, capitalist, fascist terms, that normalcy was being available to queer people. So in these late 20th century times of newfound normalcy, a lot of queer writers, a minority of queer writers, began to feel that it was necessary to bring back some of those inconvenient and uncomfortable experiences of shame. And so Love's point is that a backward-looking glance is very important to make sense of queerness, being very fully aware of the many political and historical changes that queerness has produced and has survived in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's important to acknowledge that stories of pride after Stonewall also contain deep kernels of shame, as it is important to acknowledge that stories of shame, or which appear to be stories of shame before Stonewall, also contain possibilities and kernels of pride. With this lens, Heather argues that early 20th century novels, works by writers like Anne Radcliffe, which are seen as very depressive stories because they describe queer protagonists being assaulted and being abandoned and not finding the support and the recognition they need, and often ending the narratives in very tragic circumstances. These kinds of stories, argues, it's important to read them and to find in them moments of opportunity, moments of, if not pride, then the conditions for the imagination and the creation of pride that would emerge later. Now, Love's argument is something that a lot of queer scholars and queer theorists have been making in different ways. And to generalize a little bit from stories of negative experiences or experiences of shame, other scholars have focused not just on negative experiences, but on what the focus on negative experiences says about the imagination of time, the imagination of history, and the imagination of the future, which can be drawn from exemplary works of queer art. Now, here, Elizabeth Freeman is a scholar who, in her book Time Binds, argues for a notion of time called queer temporality. Now, queer temporality is something that a lot of theorists agree on, and this essentially combines two ways of thinking. One is an acknowledgement that the definition of queerness is based on prior experiences of violence, insult, injury, and shame. This past creates the conditions for the present, and because this has been the past, the present provides us with two opportunities. One is to respond to the past, to rebuild that which was destroyed in the image of the destroyer, that is to say, to seek normalcy in the image of the normalcy which was denied. This is one option. The second option is to look ahead, to completely reject that which was destroyed because it was destroyed by someone else, and to not strive for rebuilding or regaining normalcy in the image of heteronormative or patriarchal or capitalist modernity, but rather to imagine a completely different, more utopian future. A future in which queer people would not merely seek the recognition of the straight civilization, that is, not simply strive for the recognition of gay marriage, the right to own property, the right to childcare, etc., which are all in some ways what 1980s Reagan America began to deny everyone. So in a way, the seeking after normalcy, the effort to regain the American dream was something that a lot of queer activists began to appropriate into a queer mode. So if all Americans were being denied healthcare and job security starting the 1980s, then that translated into a demand for the recognition of queer marriage, gay marriage, and so on. A lot of queer scholars and writers began to argue that this was not really a very worthwhile aim. In fact, it would be more profitable to seek a more utopian future. Now, sometimes that utopian future itself meant the basic recognition of dignity and respect. Sometimes that utopian future meant much more. Sometimes that utopian future meant the recognition of trans, intersex, asexual, and other forms of identity which were not yet imagined or articulated or available as choices. So there are multiple ways of imagining this future, and all of them have an element of utopianism in them. Now, why does all this matter for studying Michelle Cliff? Clare Savage is governed by a sense that there are these two narratives. One is her past, which is full of experiences of violence, and incidentally, the moment of violence, which the novel describes very powerfully, and for me, among the more powerful and vivid descriptions in the novel, uncannily mirrors something that I have discussed in this course while talking about a much older novel, that is The Death of the Heart by Elizabeth Bowen. In No Telephone to Heaven, Clare Savage describes a moment when she was a very young girl, when her parents discover a note that she had written in her journal in which she had described having a crush on another girl, a schoolmate of a classmate of hers at school. Now, this experience of having her parents read this very private observation and her parents having to dismiss this as something not very important or something that Claire would eventually grow out of, is a great, very powerful moment of deep hurt and shame to Claire Savage. There are, of course, other such moments, but this, in some ways, is the beginning of that series of difficult moments. And there are other such moments in which the Savage family, because they are lighter skinned black people in Jamaica, they often tend to pass as white. They migrate to the US and then to back to Jamaica. And then at some point, Claire also spends time in the UK and wanders around Europe and ultimately realizes that the circumstances into which she was born make it impossible for her to attain any sort of self-realization. I mentioned the many categories of identity which applied to Clare Savage and which also applied to Michelle Cliff. And Michelle Cliff has declared that this is an emotional autobiography. The two novels featuring Clare Savage, the first is 1984's novel Abeng, and the second 1987's No Telephone to Heaven. These two novels amount to an emotional autobiography. So the first part is clear, the struggle to attain self-realization in this heteronormative post-colonial world. The second half, the waiting for some sort of a change or some sort of an improvement in the circumstances in the future when this missing self-realization would be possible. This is also another temporality, another mode of thinking about time, which governs Clare Savage's thinking. So the novel ends, unfortunately, and Clare Savage, along with her companions, is killed in a very violent circumstance before that future can be realized. But it's important to note that Claire, along with her companions, is actively fighting, struggling to bring that future into the present as fast as possible to ensure that the injustices that they have suffered can be removed, or at least the structural causes and the sources of that injustice may be removed so that others may not have to suffer those injustices. The novel is structured as a series of reflections while Claire is on a truck, on the bed of a truck, with a group of guerrillas, that is, they are what would be called terrorists today, or domestic terrorists. They have taken up arms against the state because they feel that the state has forgotten its true allegiances. Like in many parts of the world today, the state no longer serves the people. Rather, the state serves a group of capitalist interests, a few wealthy individuals and sometimes corporations seem to control the running of governments in many parts of the world, including the developed and the developing or the underdeveloped world. Now, Jamaica, being a very poor nation, recently liberated from colonial rule, the consequences of this capitalist government or the capitalist control of government are felt even more acutely, even more sharply, and therefore there's a greater urgency that Claire and her companions face. Sitting on the flatbed of this truck, Claire notices this message that's written on the back of the truck, which is "No telephone to heaven." And Claire remembers the circumstances which led her there. Claire describes a very circuitous path which brought Claire to that location. That location and that circumstance is one of relinquishing the inheritance that Claire was born into. Claire's grandmother owned this very big piece of land, and Claire simply inherited that land and had the option of continuing to own that land and continuing to reap the benefits of owning that land after her many travels and her return to Jamaica. However, Claire decided to give up that land and to throw in her lot with the guerrillas. This is because Claire refused or failed to find any self realization in the roles that were available to her, in the roles that late 20th century Jamaican society was willing to offer or willing to accept that Claire play. The role of heterosexual, light skinned black woman, this role was not acceptable to Claire, and therefore Claire decided to take up arms against the state. Now, this story is presented across many travels and through many travels, and among these travels is an experience of failed relationships, failed attempted and failed romance and love in Europe. And Michelle Cliff has something very interesting to say about the failure of Claire's attempts to find a romantic or a life partner in Europe. And I'll read from this interview what Michelle Cliff says about it. Claire can't claim her sexuality. She's not in a place where she can. It's a very interesting thing because the lesbian subtext in Abeng was unconscious. At least I think it was. The poet Dione Brand raises the issue of the difference between being a lesbian in Europe and a lesbian in the Caribbean. And in the essay Caliban's Daughter, I talk about this. Claire's access to lesbianism in Europe would be similar to the access Nadine Gordimer's character Rosa Berger has, and also the character Merle Kinbona in Polly Marshall's The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, where lesbianism is seen as a Eurocentric, eccentric, upper-class behavior, for the most part, decadent and exploitative of third world women. Whereas for Claire to claim her lesbianism in the Caribbean would be to become a complete woman. That's the way I read it. If Claire had had an affair in Britain with Liz, which is suggested very strongly in the novel, it wouldn't have led her back to herself. It would have made her more foreign to the place she came from. But her love for Harriet is a step towards herself. And if she wasn't killed, she probably would have gone the whole way. So this is a very complex set of thoughts, and most of it should be self-evident, what Michelle Cliff is saying. But I just want to take a moment to unpack the future-oriented utopianism, which is combined with a geographical, backward-looking glance. So the future-oriented utopianism is inherent in the fact that even though in the US, in the 1980s, where Michelle Cliff was situated and where she was working as an editor with Norton Books, which enabled the thinking and the writing of this kind of work, the conversation was about the recognition of same-sex intimacy, the recognition of gay marriage and queerness. In this novel, in the representation of Clare Savage's striving after a sense of completion, Michelle Cliff presents not just queerness, but also an imagination of transness or transitory identities, because the person with whom Claire would like to form a relationship, and the relationship which, if realized, would mean for Claire the fulfillment and the realization of the person she is a person who is in a transition state. That is, a person who was born Harry but has transitioned to Harriet. And the fact that the novel very clearly indicates that this is the relationship which would have helped Claire realize herself, along with the fact that in the circumstances in which Claire lives, this is going to be impossible. And it is through Claire's efforts at changing those circumstances, at creating the conditions in which she could be united with Harriet. Precisely, it is this effort which brings about Clare's death. It very clearly suggests the presence of this very queer temporality. On one hand, there is a refusal of what is available by way of lesbianism in Europe. Clare has that option, and the way Michelle Cliff writes the novel makes it very clear to readers that simply exercising that option would not mean a realization, but would lead to a further alienation of Clare being from Jamaica. And at the same time, the awareness that what is needed lies in a future which is unattainable in Clare's lifetime. So it's a very tragic and utopian conception of time, and this justifies the use of the term queer temporality while we try to understand what's happening in No Telephone to Heaven. Now, it's important to take a moment and to think a little bit about what scholars have made of the situation and the history of Michelle Cliff's novel, and specifically the fact that Michelle Cliff is a part of a tradition of writing which can be called the Anglophone Caribbean novelist tradition. Now, there are several scholars who've written about this, but among the pioneers of this scholarly tradition is the scholar Simon Gikandi. And among Gikandi's most powerful iterations of this argument is the book Writing in Limbo. Now, Writing in Limbo begins with historical observation about the meaning of modernity, what modernity has meant for writers all over the world, and what modernity has meant for writers from the Caribbean. So, modernism and modernity are usually two related concepts, and I'll offer a very quick definition. Modernity is usually seen as defined as the creation of the social and material circumstances that lead to that establish modern civilization as we know it. That is to say, capitalism, which was itself built by slavery, capitalism and a modern conception of politics, such as democracy, the modern conception of a public, these things are taken to mean modernity. Modernism is the cultural or the cognitive accompaniment to this material and social change. Now, for the longest time, it was understood that modernity was created and conceived in Europe and in America, that it was dominantly a white and Anglo-American phenomenon. And within this conception of modernity's whiteness and Anglo-American origins, it became a tendency to read locations like the Caribbean as being somehow late entrants or late joiners to a conversation or a tradition which had begun before them. Gikandi changes this conception and argues that spaces or so-called backward spaces like the Caribbean were actually the testing grounds or the sources, the spaces where modernity was forged through the exploitation of the labor of slaves, but also through the testing of major ideas. On the other hand, in terms of the cognitive and the cultural definitions of modernism, Gikandi argues that while modernity is seen in US and Europe as a sign of expansion in spaces like the Caribbean, for native Caribbean writers, thinkers, and individuals, the history of modernism or the history of cultural modernism represents a sort of ambiguity, because this was a time when a lot of native traditions, native languages, cultural narratives, which existed in the Caribbean before the arrival of the earliest Europeans. And for Gikandi, this historical moment is the year 1492, which is the year that Christopher Columbus sets sail. This is the time that a lot of people in the Caribbean can only view as a sort of annihilation, as a sort of vacuum, as a sort of black hole, because this is a time when a lot of native traditions seem to disappear and are replaced by Anglophone traditions. So, modernity is a source of profound anxiety and mystery, and something to be repaired, something to be built for native writers from the Caribbean who work with, if not a native language, but definitely a native sensibility. The other historical events which mean that modernity makes the Caribbean, or thinking about modernity and modernism, makes the Caribbean a particularly embattled zone, or the phenomena of the plantation, as well as the phenomena of the Middle Passage. The violent transportation of slaves from Africa to the New World, and the creation of structures, the structures of the plantation where these bodies were made to slave and the profits drawn from this labor was sent to the colonial nations. These two things create a profound ambivalence and have inspired writers, novelists from the Caribbean to seek to define modernity and history in ways that challenge a very dominant Anglophone perspective. Now, it's important to note that the first chapter of No Telephone to Heaven is titled Ruinate. The word ruinate is a typical Jamaican Creole word. It's a mix of the various words for ruins or ruination that are used in various European languages. But ruinate is used specifically to describe plantations which, after the abolition of slavery in the year 1834, were abandoned. And so they take on this extremely ghostly dimension. They and this is important to note, and since I'm about to finish this lecture, this is a note on which I will end. Ruination suggests the decay or the end of something which was once very good. Ruination is an important concept because, on one hand, it suggests destruction and decay, something very negative. But on the other hand, the origins of this decay, the structural source and cause of this decay is actually a sort of liberation, that is the end of slavery. And this ambivalence, that the end of slavery produces ruination, or the historical end of slavery in legal terms, becomes the source of producing what is visible as a ruin. This is a way to understand the many contradictions that shape the Anglophone novel, that is No Telephone to Heaven, but also that shapes the kinds of Anglophone novelistic writing that we find in the work of many other women writers such as Bessie Head, who we've already discussed, and the novelists Sunetra Gupta, who we will discuss in the subsequent few lectures. With this, I will stop and I'll continue the discussion in the next lecture. Thank you.